the Information War. Okay, here's Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. If you look down in the lower right-hand corner, there's a map here, and then we have a map here. And we're going to talk about these maps a little bit. This painting hangs in the Senate wing of the Capitol building. The map of the state of Virginia actually shows slavery and railroad distances for the state, as well as concentric rings around Richmond. The other map was called the slavery map. Produced by the Coast Survey, shading technique was originally used for topographic mapping. It's actually shocking to see some of the numbers. Coming down the Mississippi Valley, the slave population was actually more than 90% of the total population. The shading indicates the relative amount of slaves versus free whites and free blacks in the various areas. Actually, Lincoln kept this particular map with him for months prior to issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. He also used it for developing strategy. By that, where the most slaves were, that was the heart of the Confederacy. And politically, I don't know, it probably insults somebody here, but it probably still is. That's, there's a lot of, that's the area is a little bit different. Okay, map of the state of Virginia. This particular map was used to track movements of both Union and Confederate armies by armchair generals, produced by the Coast Survey, as was the slavery map. You can't see it on this, but there are concentric rings around both Washington, D.C. and Richmond. And what this was used for, if they said we're 50 miles from the Capitol or whatever, somebody could look to see on it. They could use this map and look to see where the maps were relative to, or the armies were relative to their comfort level. Okay, this is a conceptual mock-up of the first map in the historical sketch of the Rebellion series of maps. This concept was developed by Adolph Lindenkohl of the Coast Survey. We follow these maps. This is this was the extent of the rebellion and the Union Army pressing down on it as of July 1862. And following the evolution of these maps, one is struck by the analogy of a glacier pressing down on the south from the north. So that's July 1862. Now this is July 1863, after the fall of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. You see the red lines go down. You see all the red on the coastal areas. So this is the state of, this is where the Union forces are at in July of 1863. This just shows, that was a blow up of the last map, but all of these little ship indications, these are where the blockade was being enacted during the war, where you see where the ships were. And this is showing the state of rebellion July 1st, 1864. Okay, the yellow line, Union has advanced this far, not a big advance relative to the year before. When they come down here, this is Atlanta right here. They're on their way to Atlanta. Once they get to Atlanta, they end up, once Atlanta's taken, they split, they march to the sea, to Savannah, and the Confederacy split into a smaller part. Just kept splitting it further and further, like a, well, whether it's a glacier or a sledgehammer coming down on the South during the war. This is the population table. They started putting those on towards the end of the war, showing both the free and slave population in the free states and the slave states. This was a continuation of the anti-slavery message of the slavery map produced early in the war. Looking at these numbers in combination with the slavery map makes it difficult to argue that slavery was not the ultimate major cause of the Civil War. This is really, it's sort of interesting. You look at this. Here's Mississippi, 436,000 slaves, 354,000 free. Some of these, let me see if I can find it. Well, 435. Some places it's 50-50. 402,301 for South Carolina. Just goes sort of on and on, the numbers. Once again, in the free states, you still had slaves in some of the free states. And Kentucky was a border state, 225,000 with 930,000 free. Even Delaware, almost 1,800 slaves. Kansas, bloody, bleeding Kansas had 2 slaves, which is, I don't know how they arrived at that. Missouri, 114,000, another border state, but 1 million free. Then 18 in New Jersey. But all of that after the war, what was the 13th Amendment, or anybody, which one that ended slavery for good in the United States? Okay, this is the Lee Custis Plantation as mapped by the Coast Survey prior to its becoming Arlington National Cemetery. It was mapped at the request of Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs. Edwin Hergesheimer, who had produced a slavery map, was the topographer in charge of this survey. This is among the first of major memorials and monuments surveyed by the Coast Survey and its descendant organizations. Once again, you look at this map and you see the slave quarters, and for all of you who've been to Arlington, you've probably been to the Lee Mansion or the Lee Custis Mansion that's there. This is what it originally looked like. And this is the full map, full topographic sheet of the future Arlington Cemetery. This is now hallowed ground holding the remains of those who have served and in many cases made the supreme sacrifice. Okay, this is some, I'll call it encomiums from high up Union Navy and Army personnel. I cannot but express the high opinion I have of the usefulness and merit of the contributions of the Coast Survey to our knowledge of the seacoast, sounds, and bays of the Atlantic and Gulf borders of the United States, without which the deliberations of the conference, and this was the blockade strategy conference, could not have been successfully conducted. Captain Samuel F. DuPont, who was the president of the, well, they called it on the conference on commission, but it was for secrecy purposes, but it was basically the blockade strategy board. Next down, George B. McClellan, head of the Union armies. Early in the war, without the Coast Survey maps, it would certainly have been very difficult, if not impossible, to have arranged and carried out most of our military operations. The only maps of any value that we possess of the country on the other side of the Potomac is the result of the labors of the Coast Survey. And then Chief Engineer of the Army under Grant was William Baldy Smith. It was my good fortune during the war to have, through the liberal views of Professor Bates, Coast Survey officers on duty with me during much of the war. No corps in the United States capable of doing the work done by these officers. With a plane table, they always made for me minute topographical maps of my positions when near the enemy. I knew all distances in my vicinity, and the artillery officers were never at fault if they had to open fire. Basically, he knew the depths of he knew everything he needed for both offensive or defensive measures. Overview of Coast Survey contributions to mapping the Civil War. The Coast Survey was a major force in mapping the campaigns, battles, and skirmishes of the Civil War. It was present on the ground from the opening volleys to the final surrender. It served on land and sea, helping determine tactics. It served in the nation's capital, helping formulate strategy. Coast Survey cartographers also were strongly anti-slavery and produced many Union propaganda products. In summation, Coast Surveyors served the Union cause and did their duty for the nation. These names are sort of a laundry list of names, but Alexander Dallas Bache, he actually developed sunstroke, or it's hard to say what happened to him, but he was directing the defenses of the city of Philadelphia when Lee was invading just prior to Gettysburg. They didn't know if Lee would have won, he might have gone on to Philadelphia, but he had sunstroke and never fully recovered. He lived for the next 3-4 years, but basically was totally incapacitated. Frederick Dorr contracted disease on the Peninsula Campaign, ended up dying a few years after the war. John Donne ended up living for the next 40 years. Clarence Findle on the Mississippi River contracted disease, died within 5 years of the war. Preston C.F. West became the chief engineer of Calumet and Hecla mines. For those of you who know the Agassiz family, their fortune was made there. John Opens died from his wound within a few years of the war. Boutelle lived for a long time, was actually accused of being drunk on duty. His assistant in charge of the office was removed from the Coast Survey in 1883 or 84 or so. Platt, well, some of these stories, I could go on. Platt's really an interesting story. I have time for about 2 minutes here. Platt was the executive officer to Boutelle on the Biff. On April 7th, 1863, the Union ironclads entered Charleston Harbor. Platt was considered so indispensable that John Rogers, who was the commander of this action on the Weehawken, wanted Platt there to pilot his vessel in and out of the harbor. So Platt's standing at a viewing port on a monitor, the Weehawken. Cannonball hits it, a bolt comes off, knocks him unconscious. So what does John Rogers do? He revives him, holds him up for the remainder of the battle for the next 2 hours so he can pilot his vessel during the firing and also while they're leaving the battle. Now, Platt, for whatever reason, he was given a battlefield commission as like the equivalent of a Lieutenant JG in the Navy, but it was not in line of promotion. So for the next 30 years, he remained a Lieutenant JG, which is pretty remarkable considering his abilities. Now, when he retired, or when he died, Congress actually passed a law that made him a commander so that his widow would not live in poverty for the rest of her life. So it was actually a law passed by Congress that recognized Platt's contribution during the Civil War. Okay, so for that, I'd like to thank you all. Just some of the stuff, NOAA Central Library, Historical Map and Chart Project I used through the Off the Coast Survey, for those of you who haven't looked at that, NOAA History site, NOAA Photo Library, and if anybody wants to talk to me about any of this, there's my email down at the bottom. Okay, thank you.
Take it down. I'll tell a story.
Okay, Chris is going to tell a story about Charleston.
In 1968, I was a lieutenant, and I was made the CO of the Rudy.